Hey guys, tonight we begin with the intimate corners of Roman civilization. We're talking about what ancient Roman sex parties were actually like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You didn't just attend one of these Roman parties. You were summoned, like a minor deity or a disappointing nephew. The invitation itself was a flex, a wax-sealed scroll implying, "We've chosen you, despite knowing everything about you." You arrive at the villa and immediately regret overdressing. Everyone looks effortlessly scandalous. You look like you wandered in from a toga sales conference. Too late now. The gates creak open, not ominously, more like they've seen things and are too tired to be dramatic about it. You step into the courtyard, where a discreet fountain gurgles in the corner like it's trying not to listen. Inside, servants move like trained shadows. They adjust cushions, pour wine, and somehow make you feel underdressed and overhydrated at the same time. A few nod at you with the same expression one might reserve for an anxious goat at a lion exhibit. The host greets you with that particular Roman smile, the one that says, "Welcome to my home. I hope you enjoy yourself, and please don't get anything sticky on the mosaic." You try to reply with equal dignity, but mostly just sweat slightly and bow too low. Around you, the elite of Roman society mingle. Senators, poets, philosophers, who haven't bathed in weeks, but can quote Plato mid-belch. A general walks by holding a goblet and the future of a small province. No one's actually doing anything scandalous yet, but everyone's thinking about it. Hard. You're guided to a couch. It's low to the ground, oddly angled and deeply suspicious. You recline awkwardly, trying to look like someone who attends these things often and definitely understands what's about to happen. You don't. The air smells of wine, roses, and ambition. Someone plays a lyre in the distance. Softly, tastefully, like foreplay for the ears. Everyone's waiting for the moment the evening tips. It hasn't happened yet, but it will. It always does. One of the slaves walks by carrying a platter shaped like something you're pretty sure shouldn't be edible. You pretend not to notice, and just like that you realize, this is less of a party and more of a power play, wrapped in silk sheets and whispered names. Let's be clear, Roman villa parties weren't come one, come all potlucks. This wasn't the kind of soiree where you show up with a bottle of wine and hope someone brought olives. No, this was an invite-only affair where your social rank mattered more than your personality. Luckily, Romans didn't really have personalities. Just titles, togas, and suspiciously flexible morals. You didn't make the guest list because someone liked you. You made it because someone could use you, or at least count on you not to scream when things got theatrical. Take a look around. That senator in the corner? He passed 3 laws this year and 3 wives last week. He's seated next to a poet whose last public reading got banned for being too anatomically detailed. Across from them is a priestess who technically shouldn't be here at all, but rumour has it she's the emperor's niece, or ex, or both. It's Rome. No one here is random. Seating is an exact science. If you're near the wine, you're either the entertainment or the liability. If you're near the host, congratulations, you're being watched. You're not sure whether that's good or bad, but either way, sit up straighter. Everyone is mingling under a thin veil of civility, like a gladiator match where the swords are replaced with compliments. "Oh, Publius, you look so refreshed. I heard your trial was exhausting." Laughter. Sips. Subtle threats. The usual. Eye contact is a weapon. A glance that lasts too long implies interest. A glance that doesn't happen at all? Insult. Accidentally locking eyes with someone's spouse is how scandals begin. Accidentally locking eyes with both of them is how they invite you to the next party. You try to strike up a conversation about agriculture. Someone counters with an anecdote, involving a grain shortage and 3 acrobats. You nod politely and make a mental note to never ask about wheat again. In this room, everything is a performance. Your posture, your laughter, even the way you sip your wine. Too fast and you're uncultured. Too slow and you're plotting something. You just want to stay neutral and unmemorable, which in Rome is impossible. But at least you're not the guy who brought his mother. That happened once. He hasn't been seen since. You start to notice something odd, aside from the room full of reclining aristocrats pretending to be shy. It's the number of people gliding silently around with perfect posture, no personal space, and a look that says, "Yes, I've seen things. No, I will not be emotionally unpacking them." These are the slaves. And make no mistake, they're not partygoers. They're the infrastructure. There's one adjusting the cushions every 12 seconds, another pouring wine with surgical precision, somehow knowing who prefers dry Falernian and who wants theirs, forget last Tuesday, strong. One is fanning a guest like it's an Olympic sport. Another is juggling trays of fruit shaped like things that make you avoid eye contact. They are everywhere, and no one acknowledges them, unless something goes wrong, in which case they are suddenly very visible and somehow always to blame. You try smiling at one of them. They blink twice, which might be the ancient Roman equivalent of don't. You look away and pretend you were admiring the wall mosaic, which unfortunately depicts something you're pretty sure isn't anatomically possible. The strange part? The slaves know more than anyone. Who's sleeping with whom? Who's trying to poison whom? Who brought their cousin under a fake name? They're walking, silent scrolls of blackmail potential, and yet completely ignored, like morally flexible wallpaper. Some are trained for entertainment. Others are trained for more interactive hosting. But none of them get to leave early. None of them get a couch. If anything, they are the couch. You're not sure if that's part of the act or just bad ergonomics, and yet, while the guests are trying to outcharm, outmaneuver, or out-undress one another, the slaves are running the whole machine, quietly, efficiently, judging you just a little, which is fair. You overhear one guest ask, "Who's that attractive man over there with the wine?" The host responds, "That? Oh, he's no one." You sip your drink, nod slowly, and mentally add, "No one is the only reason this place hasn't collapsed into chaos." You raise your glass to the nearest servant. He doesn't look at you. But you swear for half a second his eyebrow twitches. Respect. Let's be clear. This entire event hinges on one crucial element. Wine. Not conversation. Not status. Not the oil-slicked dancers with the suspiciously flexible spines. Wine. Without it, the evening would be a networking disaster. With it, it becomes a networking disaster with style. As you recline, awkwardly, on your couch, a servant pours your first cup. Roman wine is not like modern wine. For starters, it's stronger than your will to avoid drama and needs to be diluted. Not to preserve decorum, but because drinking it straight is how you end up proposing to a statue. The Romans don't just sip wine, they perform with it. Each cup is followed by a toast, a quip, and a subtle glance at the person across from you to see if they're impressed, scandalized, or both. You try to pace yourself. You fail. By the third cup, your Latin is flawless. By the fourth, you're nodding along to a story involving Neptune, a goose, and a legal loophole. At this stage, people start leaning in. Voices drop. The laughter gets breathier. Jokes start sounding more like offers. You realize that, "Would you like a fig?" might not be about fruit. You also realize you've accepted 2. The wine flows freely, as do the stories, none of which seem entirely true. One man claims to have bathed with a Vestal virgin. Another swears he once dined with Cleopatra's cousin's astrologer. Someone else insists the emperor once asked them for advice on love. Everyone nods politely while mentally ranking these lies from plausible to put down the goblet. And then the host speaks. Not loudly, just confidently. Everyone quiets. Whatever's about to happen next, Music, a performance, a change in lighting that signals we're shifting gears. It always begins right after the host makes a remark that could either be poetry or innuendo so old it's carved on tablets. You swirl your drink like you've seen this before. You haven't. But you've committed now. One more cup, and you might just have the courage to pretend you understand Roman social cues, or you'll pass out in a potted plant. Either way, you're part of the evening. By now you've accepted that this party is operating under its own set of rules, one of which seems to be that nothing can just be food. Every platter that arrives looks like it came from an erotic sculptor, with too much time and access to fresh pastry dough. A tray of figs shaped like body parts. Oysters arranged in delicate, suggestive spirals. Bread loaves that clearly did not rise by accident. Even the honey cakes wink at you. You're not sure if you're supposed to eat them, admire them, or blush and politely excuse yourself. You reach for what looks like a cluster of innocent dates, only to find them stuffed with something squishy, tart, and suspiciously symbolic. No one seems fazed. This is clearly normal. Somewhere a senator is holding a sausage with the reverence of a sacred relic. He bites it with ceremony. You lose your appetite. Across the room, a woman is hand-feeding grapes to a reclining magistrate, one by one, with the sort of intensity usually reserved for hostage negotiations. Each grape disappears into his mouth like it's part of a ritual. He chews slowly, then praises the texture. You're not sure if he means the grape. The centerpiece is a roast, possibly a boar, possibly something else that had a name and regrets. It's been decorated with fruits in places that fruits don't belong. A flute player provides ambient music while a servant slices into it delicately, revealing yet another surprise layer of something gelatinous and deeply unnerving. You nibble at a pastry shaped like Venus. It tastes like almond and poor decisions. Meanwhile, the host raises a goblet and praises the cook. Everyone claps politely, as if they haven't just consumed an entire metaphor for Roman excess. The cook bows and retreats into the shadows, presumably to prepare dessert, which, if this pattern holds, will look like either an animal, a deity, or something that gets you fined in 3 provinces. And yet, despite the culinary chaos, the message is clear. This isn't just nourishment. It's theatre. It's symbolism. It's a very elaborate way of saying, we have too much money and no filter. You take another bite. It's spicy. Of course it is. Just when you think the evening can't get more interpretive, the lyre player changes tempo and the room collectively tilts. No one says, now the show begins, but somehow everyone knows. The host leans back. The wine is refilled. A performer steps forward. And suddenly you're at a talent show hosted by Dionysus on a dare. The first act is a dancer. She emerges from behind a curtain wearing silk, barely, and enough body oil to fry an entire fish market. She moves like gravity is optional and eye contact is punishable. You want to look away, but realise that would somehow be more awkward, so you nod along as if you understand the cultural significance of the part where she starts miming an eagle. Maybe it's mythological. Maybe it's allegorical. Maybe you're overthinking it and should just drink more wine. Next comes a man with a lute and no sense of shame. He sings an ode to Venus that rhymes love with dove and above, and somehow makes all 3 sound inappropriate. You clap along politely. Everyone else laughs like it's the funniest thing since the sack of Carthage. Then there's the juggler. He starts with fruit, moves on to knives, and ends with something you're pretty sure was illegal in Athens. The crowd gasps. You pretend this is standard weekend fare and try not to choke on a decorative almond. But the real highlight of the evening is always the theatrical reenactments. These are loose interpretations of mythology. Very loose. Loose, as in, are we sure this isn't just fan fiction with props? Tonight's performance is The Rapture of Ganymede, which you remember from school, or you thought you did. This version features interpretive moaning, 3 strategically placed laurel wreaths, and what appears to be a cameo by a man in a horse mask. Everyone claps when it ends. Even the flute player looks exhausted. You begin to realise the entertainment isn't here to distract from the party. It is the party. It sets the tone, opens the door, removes the last illusion of formality. After this, anything goes, and probably will. You sip your wine and applaud. You're not sure what you just watched, but it was Roman. There's a moment in every Roman evening when the vibe shifts from polite decadence to let's see what happens. That moment arrives precisely 4 seconds after someone jokes, "It's getting warm in here," and everyone chuckles, a little too eagerly. A few guests begin loosening their togas. Not all the way, not yet, but just enough to say, "I'm relaxed," without adding, "and available." Togas, for the record, are not easy garments. They're made of enough fabric to clothe an entire village and held together by sheer stubbornness. Watching a senator try to disrobe gracefully is like watching a swan trip over its own dignity. You glance around, unsure of the protocol. There's no official announcement. No trumpet sounds to signify time for revealing choices. It's just a subtle cascade. One bare shoulder, then another, then suddenly a full chest exposed under torchlight, glistening like it rehearsed for this. Nobody says anything outright, but the looks become more suggestive. Compliments flow more freely. A woman compliments a man's biceps with the same tone one might use for civic infrastructure. Strong, reliable, slightly intimidating. You try to remain cool, but now your own toga feels like a sweaty wool prison. Someone offers to help you loosen it. You politely decline and immediately regret it. Too hesitant, too shy, or worse, too sober. There's a fine art to undressing in this crowd. Too fast and you're overeager, too slow and you're repressed. The sweet spot is accidentally seductive while adjusting a sandal. Sadly, you land on stiff tax collector on holiday. Someone near you starts a toast to Bacchus, pleasure, and forgetting names. The laughter is genuine now, a little wild around the edges. The kind of laugh that says, "We all know where this is going, and we're pretending we don't." And still, no one breaks the spell. This isn't a sprint. It's a slow slide into something unspoken. The wine, the music, the candlelight, it all works together like a sensual conspiracy. You adjust your toga, raise your goblet, and smile at the person next to you. They smile back with the exact expression of someone who's about to suggest something outrageous. In Latin. By now, you've realized that nothing in this villa happens by accident. Not the wine, not the olives that somehow look like metaphors, and certainly not the flirting. Roman flirtation isn't loud or clumsy. It's not even direct. It's more like an Olympic event in subtlety, conducted through glances, veiled comments, and how you peel a fig. Yes, apparently, even your fruit technique is under surveillance. The woman across the room. She hasn't said a word to you, but she just brushed her hand along a silk curtain in your direction. You don't know what it means, but a nearby poet is nodding like he just saw a sonnet unfold. You attempt your own subtle move, reclining slightly to show confidence. Unfortunately, the couch cushion betrays you, and you sink too far, ending up in a pose best described as collapsed senator. Smooth. The man next to you chuckles, offers a hand, and says, "Don't worry, I once fell into a brazier trying to impress a vestal." Comforting? Maybe. Concerning? Definitely. You notice conversations have changed tone. Earlier, it was politics, philosophy, and who brought the best honeyed dormice. Now, it's all double meanings and vocal inflections. Would you like more wine? Could mean, do you want to sit closer? Or possibly, let's vanish behind that curtain and discuss Cicero, loudly. Body language is everything. A lingering touch on a goblet, a laugh that lasts one syllable too long, a shared glance at a performance where both of you definitely noticed the same scandalous prop. And through it all, no one rushes. Romans are patient flirters. They build tension the way architects build temples, slowly, deliberately, and with an alarming number of decorative details. You're trying to keep up, but it feels like everyone else studied from a playbook you didn't receive. The innuendo is layered, the metaphors are confusing, and someone just used the phrase, plucking Jupiter's apple, with a straight face. Still, there's a thrill in it, the delicate, dangerous dance of saying everything without saying anything. You swirl your wine, meet a gaze across the room, and offer your most mysterious smile. You don't know what you just agreed to, but apparently that's the point. You've survived the toasts, the flirty fig metaphors, and a man reciting poetry about goat thighs. At this point, you're ready for whatever else this villa has to throw at you, and that's when you notice them. The curtains. Not regular household curtains, no. These are strategically placed swaths of fabric hung across archways, tucked into columns, and fluttering mysteriously in the breeze that shouldn't logically exist. They don't divide rooms. They imply possibilities. They whisper, "Hey, what if?" Some guests begin to drift behind them in pairs, or trios, or the kind of groupings that require a Roman census to count. Each departure is casual, a little wine, a glance, a shall we, followed by a practiced shuffle into linen obscurity. You try not to stare. You fail. But to your credit, so does everyone else. There's a subtle acknowledgement in the room, the kind of unspoken agreement where everyone pretends this is completely normal, while also trying to peek just a little. No one speaks of what happens beyond the curtains. Not directly. Some guests return flushed and glowing, like they've just debated stoicism with their entire soul. Others return looking like they wrestled a satyr. A few don't return at all, possibly out of embarrassment, or maybe they joined a touring troupe mid-party. It's unclear. You're eventually approached by someone with the confidence of a marble bust and the voice of a philosophy professor on wine number 6. They gesture toward a nearby curtain and say, "Care to explore the finer points of Roman hospitality?" You panic and respond, "I'm just here for the dates." They raise an eyebrow, impressed, confused, and disappear behind the curtain with someone else who is probably better at metaphors. And honestly, you're fine with that. You've reached a point in the evening where it's okay to just recline, sip wine, and watch as the party folds into layers of candlelight and veiled mystery. Not everyone goes behind the curtains. Some are content to stay in the main hall, talking, laughing, pretending not to notice that the floor is slowly becoming a mosaic of discarded sandals and questionable decisions. You lean back, savour your drink, and silently thank the gods for Roman architecture with excellent ventilation. By now, you've figured out that Roman parties aren't just about indulgence, they're about advancement. Because after the curtain fluttering and fig-flavoured flirting comes a quieter, more dangerous game, pillow talk diplomacy. You see, while you were busy overanalyzing a grape's symbolism, others were forging the ancient version of LinkedIn connections, except in togas and usually horizontal. Behind those perfumed curtains, secrets are whispered, deals are struck, and somehow, someone's villa just got approved for renovation without going through the Senate. All while lying on a silk cushion that smells faintly of wine, ambition, and regret. You overhear a man saying, "Of course I support your cousin's candidacy," in the same tone one might use to offer a second serving of dormice. Later, that same man is seen writing down a name on wax tablet with what can only be described as sultry urgency. This is where Roman politics thrives, not in marble halls, but in torchlit corners filled with soft voices and softer moral boundaries. The Senate debates the law. The villa bedroom? That's where outcomes are negotiated. A woman wearing nothing but jewellery and confidence lounges nearby, delicately asking a visiting general if he might consider transferring a few legions closer to her family's estate. He agrees, of course. Who wouldn't, given the persuasive power of grapes, charm, and implied blackmail? You begin to realise that your position on the couch matters as much as your position on civic reform. Being seen with the right person, or not seen, depending on the curtain density, can shift your entire reputation. One misplaced compliment or unfortunate giggle, and suddenly you're that guest, forever remembered in hushed tones and footnotes. Someone leans in and murmurs, "Did you hear about the new tax on olive oil?" It sounds innocent. It's not. In Rome, even condiments come with consequences. You do your best to contribute. You nod wisely, reference a philosopher you vaguely remember, and say something about fate and civic duty. Someone claps. You think it's sarcastic, but you'll take it. Because here, in this soft-lit room full of half-truths and full goblets, power is passed through lips, not speeches. And nothing is ever just small talk. Eventually, the party stops pretending to be civilized. Somewhere around the 7th toast and the 3rd round of interpretive lyre solos, the night shifts. Things blur. Faces blend. Your toga ends up somewhere that is decidedly not on you. But just when you think the chaos is reaching peak Roman levels, someone announces breakfast. The Romans called it ientaculum, but let's be honest, it's damage control with olives. You awaken, if you even slept, on a cushioned floor near a statue of Bacchus who's seen too much. A servant offers you honey cakes and a lukewarm cup of watered wine. It tastes like bad decisions and grapes that should have retired last season. Around you, guests begin to reassemble themselves, adjusting tunics and dignity. No one talks about what happened. That would be crass. Instead, everyone defaults to cheerful banalities like, "Lovely breeze last night," or "Did you try the quail?" as if they didn't just participate in something that could collapse a minor republic. The host, somehow glowing and wrinkle-free, strolls through the room as if he hasn't watched senators snore next to courtesans. He smiles. He claps someone on the back. He's already planning the next one, because of course he is. Rome never rests. It just naps in segments. Someone hands you a small clay token. You ask what it is. They say, "A memento." You ask what kind of memento. They smile and walk away. You decide not to ask again. There are quiet goodbyes, knowing glances, and the occasional awkward moment when two guests realize they shared a curtain but not a name. One man leaves wearing someone else's sandals. Another leaves with someone else's senator. You gather your things, some of which now include a philosophical scroll, a bruised plum, and at least 3 rumours, and make your way toward the exit. You pass a servant scrubbing something unidentifiable off a mosaic. He doesn't make eye contact. Neither do you. It's mutual respect. As you step back into the Roman daylight, blinking and bleary, you realise something. This wasn't just a party. It was a masterclass in excess, social engineering, and creative upholstery. And you? You survived it. Barely. You thought the party ended when the wine ran out, and someone accidentally knocked over a bust of Minerva. But in Rome, the real party begins the morning after, in whispered conversations, raised eyebrows, and suddenly shifting political tides. Welcome to the gladiator arena of reputation management. By lunchtime, half the city knows that Senator Publius left with a woman described only as the Panther. The other half knows she wasn't actually a guest. You hear someone at the bathhouse say, "Well, at least it wasn't as bad as last time," which only raises more questions. You, on the other hand, are desperately trying to remember if you said anything to the wrong person. Like, "Oh, maybe that story you told about Caesar's sandals being overrated." That would have been fine, if you hadn't told it to Caesar's cousin. And that charming conversation with the courtesan about grain prices. Turns out she's the unofficial advisor to a praetor, which might explain why he winked at you in the forum this morning. The thing is, these parties aren't just about indulgence. They're strategic traps lined in velvet. Every joke you made, every toast you gave, every time you mispronounced apicius while complimenting the fish, all of it is being catalogued, judged, and possibly reenacted by people with dramatic flair and too much leisure time. Still, not all fallout is bad. You notice someone nod at you across the forum, subtle, approving. A recognition that you held your own, didn't spill your wine on any sacred texts, and managed not to pass out on a marble plinth. Word travels fast, and so does gossip, but so does status. If you played your cards, and your couch placement, right. You hear of one guest being invited to a magistrate's villa next week. Apparently she told a particularly clever joke involving Cicero and olives. Another, rumoured to have secured a lucrative shipping contract right after complimenting the host's peacock. Coincidence? Hardly. You've been invited to a small gathering, nothing like that madness last night. Which is Roman for exactly like that madness, but with slightly better cushions. Congratulations. You're officially on the circuit, so you're back from the party, back in your modest domus and wondering, was any of that normal? The short answer? In Rome, absolutely. The long answer, only if you can cite at least 2 gods as references. Roman morality was flexible, like yoga in sandals flexible, the kind that could twist itself into an ethical pretzel and still toast to virtue. You might assume that all this lavish debauchery would be frowned upon, but the Romans had a simple rule. If a god did it first, it's probably fine. Take Bacchus, the god of wine and general bad decisions. His entire mythos is one long toga malfunction. Want to justify a party that ends with 4 strangers under a fruit platter? Easy. Just call it a bacchanalia. Want to discuss love in loud whispers with someone else's spouse? Venus would approve, surely. She invented flirty chaos. This divine loophole allowed Romans to behave outrageously, then write philosophical essays about how it brought them closer to the divine. Imagine waking up with wine-stained fingers and claiming, "I now understand the cosmos better." And people just nod. Because that's theology. You begin to notice that Roman society functions like a pantheon in motion. Everyone models their behaviour on some mythological figure. A well-dressed man at the Forum brags about being a Mars in bed, while a woman retorts she's more of a Minerva by day, Venus by night. You can't tell if it's flirtation or a theology quiz. Meanwhile, Stoic philosophers wander the city insisting pleasure is a distraction from virtue, and then get caught sneaking into parties with philosophical interest. Hypocrisy? No. Just dual nature of man. Thank you very much. You finally ask a local if any of this ever causes scandal. He shrugs and says, only if you do it badly. Because the truth is, morality in Rome wasn't about abstaining. It was about style, discretion, and whether or not you quoted poetry while doing it. So you take comfort in the fact that if the gods themselves behaved like this, well, who are you to argue? You survived the wine, the curtain rooms, the poetry that bordered on felony, and now, weeks later, you've returned to the daily grind of Roman life. But something has changed. You're walking through the Forum, trying to haggle over olive prices, when someone whispers, "That's the one who quoted Horace while juggling grapes." You want to correct them. It was actually Virgil, and you only dropped one. But you let it slide. Why ruin a legend? Because that's what these parties are now. Legends. Not just to you, but to everyone who wasn't there. Which conveniently includes nearly everyone. The stories get wilder with each retelling. Someone says they saw a senator riding a peacock. Another swears there was a performance involving honey, masks, and philosophical roleplay. You know for a fact that the masks were optional. Of course, not all the legacy is flattering. Moralists start publishing scrolls with titles like The Decline of Virtue in the Marble Age and Toga Off, Empire Falls. Senators who participated issue vague denials while planning the next banquet. And every few months, an emperor threatens to ban immoral assemblies. Right before hosting one that includes imported flamingos and interpretive dance about the Punic Wars. But the truth is, these parties were never just about excess. They were a mirror. A warped, wine-streaked mirror reflecting Rome's greatest paradox. An empire obsessed with order, constantly seduced by chaos. The villas, the silk, the gods invoked between courses. They weren't distractions from Roman identity. They were Roman identity. The parties didn't mock the Republic. They were its natural extension, just with better lighting and worse decisions. Even as the empire changes, as marble fades and villas crumble, the memory of these gatherings lingers. In dusty scrolls, in gossip carved into bathroom walls, in that one statue of Bacchus that definitely looks too pleased with himself. And you? You're now part of that law. A footnote in someone else's over-embellished story. Maybe they'll say you danced on a table. Maybe they'll say you debated Plato while balancing fruit on your head. Either way, you left an impression. And in Rome, that's the real legacy. So, here you are, back on your modest stone bench, sipping a lukewarm cup of watered wine, trying to piece together what, exactly, you just lived through. Was it a cultural event? A social trap? A toga-based fever dream? Yes, to all of it. Roman villa parties weren't simply about wine, scandal, or impressively flexible interpretations of mythology. They were how Rome functioned. Behind every curtain, under every laurel wreath, deals were struck, alliances formed, egos inflated and occasionally deflated by poor dance choices. It was government, entertainment, and philosophy all wrapped in silk and scandal. An empire conducting business in its bathrobe. The elite didn't separate politics from pleasure. That's a modern fantasy. In ancient Rome, the best networking happened while half-dressed and halfway into a haiku about Neptune. One well-timed toast could shift the fate of an entire province. One ill-timed belch, exile to a less fashionable island. And despite the excess, the Romans saw nothing strange about it. To them, this was tradition. A callback to older rituals when pleasing the gods meant song, wine, and maybe some interpretive wrestling under torchlight. The real mystery isn't that these parties happened, it's that they worked. Somehow from all this candlelit chaos emerged an empire that built roads, aqueducts, and the foundation for modern law. Not bad for people who thought figs were an aphrodisiac, and that dinner entertainment should include satirical mime. You've emerged from the haze changed. Wiser? Maybe. Stickier? Definitely. You've learned how to spot a disguised power play in a compliment, how to recline without spinal regret, and how to politely decline honeyed dormice without insulting the chef's grandmother. And now, as you return to normal Roman life, or whatever counts as normal when your neighbour owns a statue of Mercury wearing nothing but confidence, you carry a new understanding. These weren't just parties, they were theatre, ritual, politics, gossip incubators, and yes, occasionally chaos in sandal form. You smile to yourself, adjust your toga, which is finally staying in place, and walk off into the forum, one more Roman with secrets, stories, and just enough plausible deniability to be invited back. Because in Rome, the curtain never really closes. In medieval England, fashion wasn't an act of rebellion. It was more like a uniform assigned at birth. Your clothing announced everything: your class, your job, your gender, and whether you were allowed to sit at the high table or fetch water from the nearest muddy ditch. If you were nobility, congratulations. You got to swan about in layers of silk, brocade and velvet so heavy they required a small army of attendants to help you get dressed, and maybe a prayer or two that you wouldn't faint under the weight. Colours mattered. Rich shades like scarlet, purple and deep blue weren't just fashion statements, they were basically medieval do not enter signs. The dyes were so expensive that only the wealthiest could afford them, making bright clothing the ultimate status symbol. And yes, even your belt had its own reputation. Gilded, bejewelled, and entirely unnecessary for holding anything up. Peasants, on the other hand, had no such luxuries. Their wardrobes were made of coarse wool or linen, usually in the colour of dirt, which conveniently matched both their jobs and their laundry schedule, non-existent. A simple tunic and hose for the men, a loose-fitting gown and maybe an apron for the women. It wasn't fancy, but it got the job done, especially when the job was mucking out a pigsty. And just in case someone got ideas, like a merchant's son daring to wear fur-trimmed sleeves, there were the sumptuary laws. These royal decrees regulated who could wear what, right down to the material, colour, and trimming. You couldn't just dress up because you wanted to feel nice. That was suspicious, possibly treasonous, and the local officials were all too eager to fine you for wearing shoes that were too pointy for your class. In the grand theatre of medieval life, fashion wasn't about self-expression. It was about survival, status, and staying in your lane. Your clothes spoke volumes, and if they said the wrong thing, someone in authority would remind you very quickly just how far down the feudal ladder you actually were. If there's one thing the medieval church really didn't trust, it was a woman's hair. Flowing locks, far too tempting. Loose curls, basically sorcery. So, to keep the world safe from lust and damnation, women were encouraged, strongly, to wrap their heads up like freshly baked loaves. Enter the wimple, a head and neck covering that made every woman look like she'd just stepped out of a particularly strict convent. It wrapped around the chin, covered the throat, and often left only the face visible. Perfect if your goal was to resemble a very pious lampshade. For married women and widows, it was expected attire. Not wearing one could lead to whispers, raised eyebrows, or being called unchaste, which in medieval terms was only slightly better than being labelled a heretic. But the wimple wasn't just about modesty, it was also a social signal. The fancier the wimple, the higher your status. Rich women had theirs made from fine linen or even imported silk, often starched into stiff, architectural shapes that defied gravity and comfort. Some versions were so elaborate, they required wires and pins to keep them from collapsing like a poorly built tent. Meanwhile, poor women wore simpler versions that were more about covering lice than inciting envy. Of course, fashion being fashion, the rules eventually started bending. Some women let their hair peek out a little. Others wore transparent veils over their wimples for just a hint of allure. Medieval scandal levels. Mild. By the later Middle Ages, younger unmarried women were allowed to go bareheaded or wear their hair in braids or loose, depending on local custom. But for most adult women, the wimple remained a staple. And in a world where people rarely bathed and lice were more common than spoons, covering your hair wasn't just religious, it was also practical. The wimple helped protect your neck from sunburn, your scalp from insects, and your soul from sin, apparently. So, next time you complain about modern dress codes, just remember, there was once a time when leaving your hair uncovered was enough to get you judged, fined, or possibly exorcised. Let's talk about legs. Specifically, medieval men's obsession with showing them off, very tightly. While women were bundling themselves in layers of modesty, men in medieval England were stuffing themselves into hose, essentially medieval leggings that clung to every contour, leaving little to the imagination and even less to practicality. Originally, hose were two separate tubes tied to a belt, because nothing says fashion-forward like strapping your pants on with string. Over time, those two halves evolved into a single pair of tight-fitting trousers, usually made of wool. For the nobility, the colours were bright, the fit was snug, and the fabrics were expensive. For everyone else, the hose were functionalish, unless you needed to run, bend, or breathe. But here's where things take a turn. Enter the codpiece. You might think medieval fashion was all stiff collars and religious guilt, but somewhere along the line, someone looked at the area between the hose and said, "That needs attention." Originally, the codpiece was just a modest flap to bridge the gap between the hose. But by the 15th century, it evolved into a fashion statement, stuffed, padded, sometimes even jewelled. Because apparently, men will always find a way to turn pants into a peacocking contest. The codpiece also had a practical function. Let's say you're a knight, you've got armour on, you're at war, and suddenly, nature calls. That little flap? Very handy, but fashion ran with it. Some codpieces were shaped like small purses, others were large enough to store a dagger or some spare coins, which is either resourceful or completely unhinged. As with most trends, sumptuary laws eventually stepped in to say, that's enough. Excessively large or flashy codpieces were frowned upon, though enforcement was inconsistent at best. By the late 16th century, they fell out of fashion, replaced by a more modest approach to trousers and a collective sigh of relief from tailors everywhere. If you ever thought medieval England was all mud and misery, you clearly haven't seen how the nobility dressed for winter, or summer, or just Tuesday. Because when it came to flaunting wealth, fur and feathers were the medieval equivalent of posting yacht photos on social media. Let's start with fur. This wasn't just about staying warm, It was a full-blown fashion arms race. Ermine Ver, that's squirrel but don't tell anyone, and miniver were the prized pelts of the upper crust. Lining your cloak with fur wasn't just cosy, it was a loud, visible declaration that you didn't milk your own cows. In fact, the rarer the animal, the more important you seemed. Some lords draped themselves in exotic furs imported from the Baltic, all while pretending it was just something they had lying around. Feathers were another hot item, not for warmth, but for flair. A plume in the cap signalled status, especially if it was from something exotic like an ostrich or peacock. Now, considering there weren't many ostriches running around Yorkshire, this was strictly high-end accessorizing. Knights wore them in their helmets, and courtiers pinned them to their hats like they were trying to win the medieval equivalent of a runway challenge. Of course, with all this flaunting, the sumptuary laws made another appearance. These laws didn't just regulate fabric and colour, they also limited what animals could legally grace your shoulders. If you were a merchant who suddenly developed a taste for ermine, you might find yourself fined, or forcibly defluffed. Only royalty or high-ranking nobles were allowed to swan about in certain furs. Everyone else was supposed to stick to rabbit, sheep, or whatever died near the road. And let's not forget the moral panic. Clergy regularly preached that luxury clothing, especially fur and feathers, led to vanity, pride, and presumably the collapse of civilization. But as usual, those warnings were ignored the moment someone saw themselves in a mirror. If you've ever complained about modern fashion being uncomfortable, allow us to present the poulaine, a medieval shoe so long and pointed it could have doubled as a weapon or a makeshift compass. Before poulaine madness took over, shoes in medieval England were relatively simple. The average person wore turn shoes, soft leather footwear stitched inside out and then flipped right side out for durability. Functional, flexible, and about as stylish as a sack of potatoes, these were fine for a life of farming, hauling, and praying not to catch leprosy. But in courtly circles, things got weird. Around the 14th century, nobles decided that the most fashionable shoe was the one that extended far beyond your toes. We're talking 6 to 24 inches of pure, pointless toe extension. These were poulaines, named after Poland, which medieval fashionistas blamed for the trend. The tips were stuffed with moss or whalebone to keep them erect, because nothing says elegance like tripping over your own feet in front of the king. Naturally, the longer your shoe, the higher your status. Why? Because no one doing actual labour could possibly walk around with clown-length footwear. These shoes practically screamed, "I don't need to run, fight, or survive, I'm rich." Some even had little bells attached to the tips, just in case your absurdity wasn't audible enough. As expected, the church was appalled. Preachers condemned poulaines as sinful, vain, and a sign of moral decay. The government agreed, and sumptuary laws were passed to restrict their length, particularly for the middle class, who were beginning to adopt the style. But, like all banned fashion, the more people were told no, the more they pointed their shoes at the heavens and said, "Watch me." Eventually the trend, like most impractical footwear, went out of style. People remembered they had to walk places, and possibly fight, and maybe climb stairs without impaling themselves. But for a glorious, ridiculous moment in fashion history, pointy shoes ruled the land. And while no one can quite explain why people wanted their toes to look like fencing swords, it's comforting to know that fashion has always involved a healthy dose of delusion. We often think of armour as practical gear, something to stop arrows, deflect swords, and help you survive a Tuesday afternoon battle. But in medieval England, armour wasn't just about protection. It was also a high-fashion statement. And yes, knights cared deeply about their drip. A basic suit of armour? Good. A custom-engraved gilded set with fluted breastplates and polished elbow guards that could blind the enemy? Even better. For the upper crust of chivalry, armour was tailored like a Savile Row suit. Artisans spent weeks, sometimes months, crafting pieces that were not only functional, but fabulous. Because if you were going to die in battle, you might as well look stunning doing it. And let's not forget heraldry. Shields and surcoats bore bold colours and family crests, lions, dragons, fleur-de-lis, or just aggressive-looking birds. These weren't just identifiers in the chaos of war. They were branding. Knights were the influencers of their day, and a well-designed coat of arms was your personal logo. Tournaments became the medieval runway. Nobles would parade their finest suits of plate or chainmail, complete with plumed helmets and surcoats so bright they could blind a monk at 50 paces. Fashion even crept into weaponry. Daggers were often jewel-encrusted. Sword hilts were inlaid with silver or gold. Some even had inscriptions, not for function, but to remind your enemy just how rich you were as you stabbed them. Pure class. Of course, peasants and foot soldiers had no such luxury. Their armour was iffy. Maybe a dented helmet, a rusted chain shirt inherited from 3 battles ago, and a prayer whispered toward the sky. But for those with coin and status, armour became another medium for self-expression. If your enemy hesitated because they were admiring your breastplate, well, that was just good strategy. Eventually, as firearms emerged, full suits of armour became obsolete. But for a few glorious centuries, fashion and warfare danced hand in gauntleted hand. And in medieval England, the battlefield was just another place to serve looks. Not everyone in medieval England was a knight or a noble lady. Some were children, others were monks, and many dressed not to impress, but to send a message. Usually something like, "I belong to God," or "Please don't throw me in a ditch." Let's start with children. Medieval kids weren't dressing in adorable tiny outfits with teddy bear patterns. They were, quite literally, miniature adults. Boys wore tunics like their fathers, and girls were dressed in long gowns just like mum, minus the fur and embroidery. There was little concept of childhood as a unique stage of life. You got swaddled, you got baptized, and before you knew it, you were being put in scratchy wool and expected to know your Latin. Comfort? Optional. Now onto the clergy, who, despite all the talk of modesty and humility, could still put on a show. Bishops and abbots often wore richly dyed robes, embroidered stoles, and elaborate mitres that looked like upside-down boats. Gold thread, fine linen, and jewelled crosses made them stand out from the crowd, which was probably the point. While priests lower down the ladder wore more austere garments, simple black cassocks or rough brown robes, higher-ranking church officials were practically walking relics. But clothing for clergy wasn't about personal taste. It was about symbolism. Every colour, every layer, every accessory had a meaning. Purple for penance, white for purity, red for martyrdom, because nothing says spiritual devotion like coordinating your outfit with the blood of saints. And then there were those in religious orders like monks and nuns. Their habits were the medieval equivalent of uniforms, practical, consistent, and intentionally drab. The idea was to eliminate vanity and focus on the soul. But even here you had fashion politics. A Benedictine habit wasn't the same as a Franciscan one. Some orders favoured hoods, others banned shoes. In essence, your robe told the world which holy club you belonged to, and whether you were the type to chant at sunrise or just silently judge others. So whether you were a barefoot novice, a jewel-bedecked bishop, or a 9-year-old peasant already dressed for a lifetime of labour, your clothing in medieval England didn't just cover your body. It revealed your role, your values, and the very limited range of your choices. If medieval England had one unspoken rule, it was this: stay in your sartorial lane. And if you didn't? The Crown was ready with a tidy little tool called the sumptuary law, a royal decree that basically said, "Nice shoes. Too bad they're illegal." These laws weren't subtle. They dictated who could wear what, in what colour, with what material, and even how wide your sleeves could be. That's right, sleeve width was legislated. You could measure someone's legal status by how far their elbows flared. If your sleeves looked like sails and you weren't a duke, congratulations, you were breaking the law. The original purpose of these laws was to keep the class structure visible. The elites wanted to make sure that no ambitious merchant or newly rich knight started dressing like nobility. Heaven forbid someone without a title might wear scarlet silk lined with ermine and confuse the peasants. These rules applied to everything: shoes, hats, embroidery, jewellery, fur linings, even buttons. Buttons, If you were wearing too many, or they were too ornate, you might get fined. In some towns, officials would literally walk the streets and inspect people's outfits. It was less fashion police, more actual police with fines and public shaming. Of course, enforcement was inconsistent. Some laws were passed and promptly ignored, while others were taken deadly seriously. One tailor's apprentice was famously jailed for wearing a silver-buckled belt reserved for minor gentry. His defence? It was a gift from my uncle. The judge was not impressed. But here's the irony. The more the laws tried to restrict fashion, the more obsessed people became with pushing the limits. Loopholes were invented, tailors got creative. A banned fabric? No problem, just dye a legal one to resemble it. Forbidden furs? Hide them in the lining. Sumptuary laws tried to keep society neat, tidy, and visually stratified. But fashion, being the chaotic little beast it is, refused to play along. People found ways to signal status, even without breaking the rules, through subtler cuts, regional trends, or just sheer confidence. Because in medieval England, dressing above your station wasn't just a style choice. It was a rebellion wrapped in velvet, and sometimes sewn shut with gold thread. Medieval fashion may seem like a far-off curiosity, something best left to tapestry reenactors and Renaissance fair vendors, but its influence still lingers in ways that are sneakier than a monk's vow of silence. For starters, the medieval obsession with clothing as identity, still very much alive. Today we might swap ermine-lined cloaks for tailored suits or designer logos, but the idea remains. We dress to be seen, to belong, or to subtly, or not so subtly, show off. That instinct to communicate power, piety, or rebellion through fashion? The Middle Ages had it down centuries before Instagram got the memo. Take academic robes, for example. That billowing black gown you wear at graduation? That's straight out of a medieval university, where scholars dressed like monks, because in many cases, they were monks. Those long hoods, tassels, and colour-coded stripes all descend from clerical dress codes, just modernised to make you look scholarly without making you take a vow of poverty. Even today's wedding dresses, those flowing white gowns that look straight out of a fairy tale, have roots in medieval ceremonial wear. Back then, brides often wore their best gown, whatever colour that was, but among the elite, weddings became prime opportunities to showcase wealth. Gold-threaded veils, imported fabrics, and extravagant headdresses turned marriage into a couture event. And let's not forget the lingering romanticism of the period. Writers, painters, and filmmakers have long mined the medieval wardrobe for inspiration. From King Arthur films to fantasy series like Game of Thrones, the look of medieval England remains fashion shorthand for nobility, mystique, and vaguely ominous chanting. Of course, not everything stuck. We don't line our sleeves with squirrel anymore, usually, and codpieces have, thankfully, retired from public life. But the spirit remains. Clothes as a declaration, a performance, a soft kind of power. In the end, fashion in medieval England was about more than covering the body. It was about revealing the soul, your rank, and just how close to royalty you could pretend to be without getting fined. In ancient Egypt, beauty wasn't just vanity. It was theology with a compact mirror. Looking good wasn't a suggestion. It was expected. The gods were beautiful, radiant, youthful, and symmetrical, and if you wanted any chance of winning their favour, you had better look the part. Pimples were not divine, neither were wrinkles. From the bustling markets of Thebes to the quiet tombs along the Nile, beauty was baked into daily life. This wasn't just for queens and courtiers. Everyone from high priests to housemaids took part in the sacred ritual of self-maintenance. Being well-groomed signalled that you were clean, disciplined, and spiritually aligned. Translation: if you didn't exfoliate, the gods might think you were lazy. Cosmetics were considered holy tools, not just for seduction, but for protection. There was no divide between beauty and religion. Both were part of the same sacred script. Temples stored jars of scented oils just as carefully as they stored sacred scrolls. Perfume was used in worship. Kohl eyeliner wasn't just stylish, it protected the wearer from the sun and warded off evil spirits. And yes, even in the afterlife, you were expected to look fresh. That's why tombs were filled with beauty kits, because nobody wants to arrive in the underworld looking tired. Priests, in particular, were held to rigid grooming standards. They shaved their entire bodies, wore clean linen, and applied scented oils before rituals. Why? Because they were standing in for the gods themselves. You don't show up to a divine ceremony smelling like yesterday's goat stew. But it wasn't all holiness and hygiene. Beauty also had a political edge. Pharaohs used it to project divine power. Queens like Nefertiti became living embodiments of idealized beauty, not just through art, but through carefully maintained appearances. Being beautiful was being powerful. Being powerful meant looking like you hadn't aged since birth. In short, ancient Egyptian beauty was less about trends and more about eternal truths. It wasn't about impressing your date, it was about aligning your body with cosmic order. And if that meant slathering yourself in perfumed oil and lining your eyes with ground-up minerals, so be it. You may think smoky eyeliner is a modern invention, but ancient Egyptians had it mastered over 4,000 years ago, and they didn't even need a YouTube tutorial. The iconic black lines seen on statues, murals, and mummies weren't just for drama. That jet black pigment? It was kohl, and it was everywhere. Men, women, and even children wore it. Not because they all secretly aspired to be Cleopatra, but because kohl had serious multitasking powers. First, it was practical. The Egyptian sun didn't play around, and the dark pigment helped reduce glare and shield the eyes. Basically, ancient sunglasses in paste form. Made from galena, a mineral rich in lead sulfide, kohl also had antibacterial properties. Science actually backs this up. Studies have shown that trace amounts of lead can stimulate the body's immune response, helping prevent eye infections. In short, it looked good and it worked. But in true Egyptian fashion, there was more going on than meets the eye, literally. Kohl had spiritual significance too. It was believed to protect against the evil eye, a malevolent curse delivered through a dirty look. Lining your eyes wasn't just stylish, it was spiritual armor. Children were often marked with exaggerated eyeliner for extra protection, especially during festivals or travel. Application was an art form. Kohl came in decorative containers, and applicators ranged from simple sticks to ornate wands made of bone or metal. You'd dip it in the powder, lick it or moisten it with oil, and then carefully apply the mixture to the upper and lower eyelids. Ancient eye makeup, 50% glamour, 50% warfare prep. And Egyptians weren't subtle about it. Eyes were elongated and exaggerated to mirror the Eye of Horus, a symbol of divine protection, healing, and royal power. So even if you didn't own land or servants, your eyeliner could still say, "I'm channeling divine energy. Back off." If the eyes were outlined with kohl to invoke the gods, then the cheeks and lips were painted to look like you were blessed by them. Ancient Egyptians didn't shy away from colour, especially not red. And their go-to beauty product? A bold, earthy pigment called red ochre. Red ochre was ground from naturally occurring iron-rich clay and mixed with fat, gum, or resin to create a smooth paste. The result? A vibrant crimson tint that could be applied to both lips and cheeks. Think of it as the original multipurpose stick. Part lipstick, part blush, all drama. Now, why red? In Egyptian symbolism, red represented life, vitality, and passion. Everything a healthy, beautiful person should exude. Pale skin might have been fashionable in later centuries, but in ancient Egypt, colour meant strength. A bit of crimson on your face told the world, "I'm alive, desirable, and probably favoured by the gods." And this wasn't limited to women. Men, especially of noble or royal rank, used red ochre as well. Pharaohs, priests, and elite partygoers would show up to ceremonies and banquets with perfectly tinted lips. In fact, art from the New Kingdom often shows both genders with that signature reddish pout. If you were wealthy, you were rosy. If not, you probably blended into the sand. Application wasn't subtle either. No blending, contouring, or nude tones here. Egyptians believed in visibility. If you were making offerings to the gods or just showing up to a dinner party, your face needed to pop. For special occasions, the red pigment might even be layered or mixed with a touch of gold dust for extra divine flair. Of course, not all cosmetic concoctions were safe. Some poorer quality rouges contained ingredients that were harsh or even toxic, especially for those who couldn't afford the high-end imports. But beauty in ancient Egypt was often worth the risk, because looking radiant was tied to status, health, and even your chances of a pleasant afterlife. Ancient Egyptians didn't just want to look divine, they wanted to smell like it too. And in a world where the sun baked everything and daily showers weren't exactly a thing, fragrance became both a luxury and a necessity. Enter perfumed wax cones and aromatic wigs, two of the most delightfully bizarre inventions in beauty history. Let's start with the cones. These weren't just fancy hats. They were made of scented animal fat or beeswax mixed with essential oils. Lotus, myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon were common favourites. During festivals, feasts, or religious ceremonies, guests would place these cones directly on their heads. Over the course of the evening, body heat would slowly melt the wax, releasing its perfume. Picture a slow-dripping air freshener, but chic. Now, before you worry, no one just slapped a wax lump onto their bare scalp. Most Egyptians, particularly elites, shaved their heads for cleanliness and comfort. Then, they'd don finely made wigs, which acted as both status symbols and practical platforms for melting cones. These wigs weren't your average Halloween costume variety. They were masterpieces made from human hair or plant fibers, intricately braided and styled to show off wealth and sophistication. Wigs were so important that many tombs included at least one in the burial goods. You needed a good scent and a solid hairdo to face the gods after all. Some wigs were even perfumed directly, soaked or dusted with aromatic powders, turning the wearer into a walking bouquet of sanctity and opulence. Fragrance wasn't just for the living either. Mummies were anointed with oils, and tombs were often filled with jars of perfume, because in the afterlife, smelling divine was still on the checklist. Being foul-smelling wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered unholy. A clean, sweet scent symbolized purity, life, and divine favor. Living in Egypt meant one thing was guaranteed: sun. Relentless, baking, unforgiving sun. And while modern folks might reach for SPF 50 and complain about humidity, the ancient Egyptians had their own surprisingly advanced approach to skincare, one that blended science, ritual, and a whole lot of oil. Let's start with the basics. Daily cleansing. Egyptians bathed more than most ancient cultures. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was tied to spirituality. Dirt was disorder. Filth attracted demons. So everyone from priests to peasants tried to stay scrubbed, often using a paste made from natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, and water. Think of it as the OG exfoliating scrub, no apricot bits, just chemical cleansing power strong enough to preserve mummies. But the real heart of Egyptian skincare was moisturizing, and they didn't skimp. The dry desert air, intense heat and wind made skin maintenance essential. Enter moringa oil, castor oil, sesame, olive, and animal fats. These were applied liberally to the skin to protect against sun damage, lock in hydration, and maintain a youthful glow that even Hathor would envy. They also dabbled in anti-aging solutions. Yes, really. Recipes on papyrus scrolls mention mixtures of milk, honey, and frankincense, each with antibacterial or soothing properties. Almond oil was popular for reducing wrinkles, and fenugreek was used to keep skin smooth. Cleopatra herself was rumoured to bathe in sour milk for its lactic acid content. A little pungent, perhaps, but hey, it's chemistry. Skincare wasn't just for beauty, though. It was medicine. Wounds were treated with honey for its healing properties. Acne was soothed with crushed lotus or barley. Rashes and burns. Aloe vera was already in their toolkit. Many of these remedies still show up in modern skincare products, minus the crocodile fat and the occasional crushed beetle. Even the dead got spa treatment. During mummification, the body was coated in oils and wrapped in linen soaked with balms. Eternal youth was the goal, even if it was mostly symbolic. For ancient Egyptians, body hair was not a vibe. In fact, smooth, hairless skin was the gold standard of beauty, hygiene, and even morality. Hair was seen as messy, impure, and, perhaps worst of all, foreign. To be civilized, you had to be sleek. Think dolphin, not woolly mammoth. This cultural obsession went beyond the face. Full-body hair removal was the norm for men and women alike, from eyebrows to ankles. Even priests and high officials were expected to keep themselves meticulously shaved, because when you're performing sacred rites in front of the gods, the last thing you want is armpit stubble. So how did they do it? Razors, for starters. Made from copper or bronze, early Egyptian razors were often shaped like small crescent moons. They were sharpish, effective-ish, and came with a high risk of nicks if you weren't careful. Shaving was a regular part of grooming, not a once-a-week chore. But for those who couldn't, or wouldn't, shave daily, there were alternative methods. Sugaring, for example, was basically ancient waxing. A paste made of honey, sugar, and lemon juice was heated, applied to the skin, and then ripped off with a strip of linen. Sound familiar? That's because modern sugaring salons are still doing it exactly the same way. Egyptians were the blueprint. They also used pumice stones, plucking tools like tweezers, and even depilatory creams made from wild plants and less charming ingredients. Some recipes involved applying a paste of crushed animal bones and lye, followed by prayers to avoid third-degree burns. The price of beauty was steep, but worth it, apparently. Hairlessness wasn't just aesthetic, it was spiritual. Removing body hair symbolized purification. Being smooth meant being clean, civilized, and blessed by the gods. Hair, by contrast, was associated with the wild, the foreign, the animalistic. It's no accident that enemies were often depicted with scruffy beards and unkempt manes. Wigs helped complete the look. Since most elites shaved their heads for comfort and hygiene, wigs provided style without the sweat. You could be bald underneath and still rock intricate braids, beads, and perfume cones on top. Ancient Egyptian beauty products weren't just cosmetic. They were potent little spells in a jar. Every oil, every paste, every fragrant resin carried meaning. For Egyptians, ingredients weren't chosen just for how they made you look, but for what they represented, and occasionally for how well they scared off skin infections and evil spirits. Let's start with the all-stars. Frankincense and myrrh weren't just for sacred ceremonies or future biblical cameos, they were skin saviors. Frankincense was burned for its aromatic smoke, ground into powder for masks, or mixed with oils to rejuvenate skin. Myrrh, sticky and golden, had antiseptic properties and was used to treat wounds, soothe wrinkles, and even embalm the dead. In other words, it was anti-aging to the extreme. Then there was honey, a natural moisturizer, antibacterial miracle, and all-around MVP of the ancient beauty world. It was mixed into masks, applied to acne, or layered over chapped lips. Want softer skin? Try a mask of honey, milk, and crushed lotus petals. Want divine favor? Add a chant while applying. Egyptian skincare blended natural science with ritual magic. Many cosmetic recipes were written on papyrus scrolls, often alongside medical treatments and spells. A facial cream might include aloe vera, cucumber, and a line like, "To make the skin of the face shine like the moon." Bonus points if the moon god Thoth approved. Some ingredients, however, wandered into questionable territory. Crocodile dung, for instance, was believed to ward off evil and was sometimes included in skin salves. Yes, it was gross, but in a world where spiritual protection mattered as much as physical health, even a swampy smear was fair game. There were also love potions disguised as perfumes, anti-aging balms whispered over by priestesses, and makeup formulas passed down through generations. Beauty was chemistry, but also ceremony, a daily ritual that blended aesthetics with divine energy. These sacred mixtures weren't just about looking good. They were about aligning yourself with cosmic forces, keeping your body, your spirit, and your reflection in harmony with the gods. It was skincare meets spirituality, with a touch of drama and maybe a bit too much galena. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids and pharaohs, but behind the scenes, a booming beauty industry was quietly at work. And no, this wasn't a few villagers trading face masks at the market. This was a full-scale economy built around oils, perfumes, pigments, grooming tools, and the eternal quest to look like you had divine ancestry. Merchants along the Nile specialized in cosmetics, selling everything from perfumed balms to jars of coal and red ochre. These weren't just homemade mixtures either. Some ingredients were imported: frankincense from Punt, myrrh from Nubia, and exotic oils from across the Mediterranean. If you had money, you had access to the ancient world's most luxurious beauty products. And if you didn't, you probably just crushed some local herbs and hoped for the best. Cosmetic jars and vessels were art forms in themselves. Rich Egyptians stored their makeup in alabaster containers, carved ivory boxes, or faience pots shaped like deities or lotuses. Having beautiful packaging wasn't just a flex, it was part of the ritual. You didn't slap on eyeliner from a clay pot. You honoured your face with a touch from a hand-carved cosmetic spoon shaped like a swimming girl or a gazelle. There were even professional beauticians. Yes, ancient glam squads. Elite women had servants trained in grooming, perfuming, hair maintenance, and cosmetics. These attendants weren't just applying lipstick, they were keeping up a sacred standard of appearance. Priests had their own grooming regimens too, often maintained by temple workers, because even communing with the gods required a smooth chin and a well-oiled scalp. And let's not forget the role of beauty in death. Tombs of the wealthy often contained full grooming kits, ensuring that the deceased could continue their skincare routine in the afterlife. It wasn't just about vanity. It was about arriving before the gods looking fresh, fragrant, and fully moisturized. In short, the ancient Egyptian beauty industry wasn't a side hustle. It was a pillar of society, woven into religion, status, trade, and daily life. Looking divine wasn't optional. It was an enterprise, and business, quite literally, was eternal. In most cultures, death is where skincare stops. In ancient Egypt, it's where it went pro. The pursuit of beauty didn't end with your last breath. It entered its final, most glamorous phase. Because if you were going to face the gods, the afterlife, and eternal judgment, you'd better look like a freshly anointed deity, not a tired soul from the desert. The mummification process was part sacred rite, part full-body makeover. First, your body was cleansed and shaved. Yes, even in death, hair removal was a must. Then came the oils. The embalmers anointed the skin with perfumed balms, resins, and spices. Myrrh, cinnamon, frankincense. Not just to preserve the flesh, but to restore the deceased's divine glow. Looking like a desiccated prune was not acceptable in the field of reeds. Next, cosmetic touches. Eyelids were often painted with kohl. Lips might be tinted with red ochre, and cheeks rouged to simulate life. Bodies were wrapped with intention, each layer of linen sometimes inscribed with protective spells or soaked in scented oils. If you'd been wealthy in life, your tomb likely held a full makeup kit, jars of unguents, mirrors of polished bronze, even perfumed cones for the scalp. Because you never know when Osiris might call you to a banquet. Tomb paintings reinforced this beautified ideal. The deceased were never depicted as old, wrinkled, or frail. Instead, they appeared forever young, toned and radiant, often shown in idealized clothing, with perfectly painted faces and flawless skin. Eternal beauty wasn't a metaphor. It was the goal. Why all this effort? Because appearance was status, even in death. The gods were flawless. If you wanted to join them, you had to match their aesthetic. The more polished and perfumed you were, the more likely you'd pass through the weighing of the heart with grace, and maybe a little divine envy. So while today's skincare routines promise ageless radiance, ancient Egyptians were already chasing it thousands of years ago, with sacred oils, ritual pigments, and enough eyeliner to outlast an apocalypse. In the land of the Nile, beauty was never fleeting. It was eternal. She didn't volunteer. No one did. The calling of a Vestal virgin wasn't about passion or personal devotion. It was about being born into the right family, with the right body, at the right time. Somewhere between the ages of 6 and 10, a Roman girl could suddenly find herself torn from her parents, placed in ceremonial white, and told she now belonged to the goddess Vesta. The selection process was brutal in its perfectionism. Candidates had to be freeborn, physically flawless, and the daughter of 2 living parents in good social standing. If your father had ever sold fish, or your mother once sneezed during a ritual, forget it. Rome wanted girls who were pure not just in body, but in bloodline and household reputation. The choosing took place under the watch of the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome. He would publicly touch the chosen girl, declaring her captured, an ancient ritual echo of wartime spoils. In that moment, her legal identity shifted. Her father no longer held authority over her. She became property of the state, sworn to 30 years of service in the Temple of Vesta. Imagine the confusion of a 9-year-old girl taken from the warmth of her mother's arms and placed in a marble sanctum where silence was sacred and mistakes could bring divine wrath. Her long hair was cut, her tunic changed, and her name forgotten. She would no longer be herself. She was now a Vestal, guardian of the eternal flame, symbol of Rome's survival. To outsiders, she was revered, even envied. Vestals were above the law, could own property, and walked through the forum accompanied by lictors like senators. But make no mistake, this was a golden cage, a life shaped not by choice, but by ritual. Her girlhood ended with ceremony, and what followed was a life of cloistered privilege, immense responsibility, and a vow of chastity so sacred that breaking it meant death. She was chosen to serve the gods, but first she had to leave herself behind. The first time she crossed the threshold of the House of the Vestals, it must have felt like stepping into another world. Behind her, family, childhood, identity. Ahead, silence, discipline, and sacred fire. Nestled beside the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum, the House of the Vestals was both sanctuary and prison. Marble columns surrounded a serene courtyard filled with statues of past priestesses. The statues weren't decorative, they were reminders. These were the women who had served faithfully, kept their vows, and earned eternal honour. Or, if their statue was missing, well, everyone knew what that meant. The daily life of a young novice began with training. The first decade of service was for learning, rituals, chants, purification rites, and the exacting care of Vesta's eternal flame. That fire wasn't symbolic. It was a living representation of Rome's heartbeat. If it went out, people panicked. Wars were started. Heads rolled, and someone, probably her, would take the blame. Discipline was absolute. Vestals had to be silent when required, speak when commanded, and act with flawless decorum. Even laughter was regulated. Novices rose at dawn, bathed in spring water, and dressed in a white linen gown secured with a band of wool, symbolizing chastity and purity. A crimson sash hinted at their sacred status, and their hair was bound in intricate styles passed down for generations. She lived with 5 others, each at a different stage of service. There were elder Vestals, serious, composed, and frightening in their authority. They watched the novices closely, correcting errors with a sharp word or a look that cut deeper than any lash. But there was privilege too. Vestals were considered untouchable. Their word could override a man's in court. They travelled with bodyguards. If a condemned prisoner passed one on the street and she looked at him, he was pardoned instantly. That kind of power was intoxicating, even for a girl still learning her place. Still, it was a life of paradox, immense honour and suffocating expectation. For now, she was just beginning, learning the language of the gods, mastering the rhythm of ritual, and trying not to trip in her ceremonial sandals, because in the world of Vesta, one wrong step could echo forever. The eternal flame of Vesta wasn't just a flickering hearth, it was Rome's soul, its protection, prosperity, and divine legitimacy all wrapped in one steady glow, and it was her job to keep it alive. Every day, the Vestals took turns tending the sacred fire inside the Temple of Vesta, a round structure meant to resemble the primitive huts of early Roman kings. The fire sat in the centre, surrounded by walls open to the sky, because even the gods needed ventilation. The moment she crossed into that space, she wasn't a girl anymore. She was a living conduit between Rome and the divine. Keeping the flame alive was more than lighting logs and sweeping ash. It involved ritual precision. Only certain woods were permitted. The fire could not be started with flint or steel. It had to be kindled using sacred methods, invoking Vesta's favour. When it died out, and it sometimes did, it was treated as a national crisis. The culprit faced public shame, lashes with rods, or worse. But the flame wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It represented Rome's eternal continuity, its civic order, and its identity as a chosen city under divine protection. If the flame flickered, so did Rome's confidence in itself. Her hands, still small from childhood, would carefully arrange kindling as priests chanted invocations nearby. Ashes were gathered and placed in sacred pits beneath the temple. Everything had meaning. Nothing was casual. There were other duties too. She helped prepare sacred salt cakes used in state rituals. She guarded wills, Julius Caesar's, famously. She watched over holy objects no man was permitted to see, including the Palladium, the sacred statue said to guarantee Rome's invincibility. Her life was no longer her own. It was fused into the heartbeat of an empire. And while the forum bustled outside with merchants, senators, and thieves, she moved in another rhythm, one of silence, smoke, and sacred duty. Passers-by might glimpse her white veil as she passed, always escorted, always untouchable. But within the walls of the temple, beneath the eternal flame, she laboured quietly, for a fire that could never die, and a city that refused to fall. For a woman in ancient Rome, life was typically limited. Your father's rule passed to your husband, and your opinions died quietly in the atrium. Unless, of course, you wore the white veil of Vesta. Then suddenly, you became a legal anomaly. A woman above men, a priestess above politics. A symbol no one dared to touch. The Vestal virgins occupied a sacred grey area in Roman society. Though women, they were granted rights usually reserved for male citizens. They could own property, make wills, and free slaves. Their testimony in court carried exceptional weight, requiring no oath. Rome assumed that Vesta's daughters could not lie. In public, they were escorted by lictors, the same officials who flanked magistrates. Even consuls stepped aside when a Vestal passed. If her litter moved through the forum, the crowds parted. People averted their eyes, not from disrespect, but reverence. And a touch from her, accidental or deliberate, could pardon a condemned man on the spot. She was given the best seats at the theatre. She dined at the emperor's table. She sat in the imperial box during gladiatorial games, flanked by senators who would never dare to address her without formal permission. Her presence alone was considered auspicious, and her appearance was just as symbolic. The infula, her sacred headdress, marked her as consecrated. The stola, pure white, proclaimed chastity. Her shoes, bound in red leather, were ceremonial, meant for walking paths that no ordinary woman ever would. Inside her private quarters, she lived better than most Roman matrons. The house of the Vestals had multiple floors, gardens, fountains, even personal slaves. It was a cloistered life, but not a deprived one. She was exempt from the burdens of marriage, childbirth, and male authority. But there was a catch. All of it, the lictors, the land, the untouchable dignity, was balanced precariously on a single condition: that she remain pure. Not just untouched, but untouched in body, thought, and behaviour. Her power was absolute, but so was the fragility of it. Because in Rome, one whisper of impropriety could collapse an entire life of sacred privilege. The pedestal was high, but the fall was catastrophic. It began with a vow that could silence rooms. 30 years, an entire lifetime for some, devoted to chastity, ritual, and discipline. Spoken once, it was binding. No loopholes, no takebacks. From the moment she whispered her promise to Vesta, her body and will were no longer hers. The structure of the vow was rigid, almost militaristic. The service was divided into 3 decades. The first 10 years were for learning, how to tend the flame, recite the rites, prepare the sacred meals, and behave with the stillness of a marble statue. These years were marked by instruction, correction, and observation. She was the student, silent, watchful. The second decade was for service. Now a fully trained Vestal, she was entrusted with the most sacred tasks. She could tend the fire alone, oversee temple rituals, and even supervise new initiates. She was the flame's guardian and Vesta's human representative in the beating heart of Rome. The final 10 years were for teaching. She became the elder, passing on the rituals to a new generation of novices. Her voice, once timid, now echoed with quiet authority through the stone halls of the temple. This was as close as a woman in Rome could come to leadership without invoking scandal. But behind the order and prestige was an invisible strain. 30 years of absolute celibacy. Not just in deed, but in reputation. A flirtatious glance, an unchaperoned walk, a rumour whispered too loudly. Any of these could unravel everything. And there were no second chances. If she broke her vow, or was even believed to have done so, the punishment was not symbolic. It was fatal. Some Vestals bore the burden proudly. Others withered under it. But none could escape it. Their vow was both a crown and a collar, elevating them above all women while locking them in a role more rigid than any marriage. Only after completing all 30 years was she free. Free to marry, to own a house, to re-enter society, though few did. Most remained alone, known forever as the women who had once been sacred. For 3 decades, she belonged to a goddess. After that, the world didn't quite know what to do with her. On the surface, the life of a Vestal was wrapped in beauty, ceremonial garb, marble halls, incense trailing through sacred air. But beneath the veil of divine service lay a world defined just as much by fear as by faith. Rome relied on ritual to maintain cosmic balance. If the gods were pleased, crops grew, armies won, and the city thrived. If they weren't, well, fires broke out, omens darkened the sky, and disasters followed. And so, every ceremony had to be perfect, every word pronounced with precision, every gesture exact. The Vestals were at the centre of this cosmic contract. A single misstep wasn't just embarrassing, it was sacrilege. Even high-ranking priests were afraid to offend them. They represented Vesta, and Vesta was not known for mercy. When a Vestal approached a sacrificial altar, no one spoke. When she made offerings, the city paused. It wasn't just respect. It was a deep, superstitious awe, the kind reserved for lightning and oracles. But their presence wasn't always comforting. A Vestal's gaze could grant mercy, but her withdrawal could doom you. The people feared her power because it was pure, divine, and, most dangerously, female. She lived outside the normal hierarchy, bound to no man. In a society that controlled women's roles carefully, this independence was both admired and feared. During public ceremonies, especially the Vestalia in June, citizens flocked to the temple. Bakers unbarred their ovens. Matronae walked barefoot to offer prayers for fertility and hearth. And there she stood, central to it all, performing rites passed down for centuries. But always with the knowledge that any mistake, any missed chant or poorly timed movement could be seen as an omen. And omens had consequences. The weight of this responsibility never lifted. Vestals might seem serene, gliding through rituals with ethereal calm, but underneath was a tightrope walk, always under scrutiny. One error could bring not just personal disgrace, but a public sense of doom. Their life was not one of quiet meditation. It was high stakes, high visibility, and no room for error, because to be a Vestal was to walk the boundary between divine order and human catastrophe, one ceremony at a time. To the Roman mind, few crimes were darker than a Vestalis unchaste. Her vow of purity wasn't just personal, it was woven into the fate of the city itself. If she broke it, or was even suspected of breaking it, the punishment wasn't just severe. It was designed to terrify. The logic was brutal. A Vestal's body belonged to Vesta. Violation of that body meant violation of the goddess, which meant divine punishment for all of Rome. Earthquakes, plagues, military defeats, any disaster could be linked, in hindsight, to a Vestal's rumoured affair. The solution? Purge the offence, appease the goddess. The accused Vestal was stripped of her sacred garb. The white veil was removed, the crimson band untied. Her body, once untouchable, was now scrutinised for signs of guilt. Flushed cheeks, trembling hands, averted eyes. Proof? Not required. Suspicion was often enough. And the punishment? Burial alive. Roman law forbade spilling a Vestal's blood. So they found a loophole. She would be lowered into an underground chamber just outside the city walls, in the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked. There she would find a small room with a bed, a lamp, and a loaf of bread. Symbolically, it wasn't murder. Realistically, it was a slow death in darkness. The procession was public, silent, grief-stricken. The condemned Vestal was led through the city in a closed litter, her face hidden. Crowds gathered, but no one spoke. It wasn't entertainment, it was civic mourning. Rome was cleansing itself. No man could be present in the chamber. The priest would lower her down, seal the shaft with earth, and walk away. There would be no monument, no epitaph, just the knowledge that one of Vesta's daughters had fallen, and taken a piece of the city's soul with her. And what of the alleged lover? If named, he'd be beaten to death publicly, often in the forum. He got pain. She got silence. In truth, some accused Vestals were likely innocent, victims of political schemes or convenient scapegoats. But once accused, there was no defence, no appeal. Because in the eyes of Rome, when a Vestal broke her vow, she wasn't just betraying the gods. She was betraying Rome itself. If she made it through all 30 years, unscathed, unblemished, and utterly devoted, then, and only then, was she released. The vow fulfilled, the flame tended, the rituals passed on. She was no longer a Vestal virgin. She was something else entirely. Liberation came with ceremony. The Pontifex Maximus released her from her sacred obligations, and for the first time in 3 decades, she was free to choose her own life. She could marry. She could live alone. She could own property and act as a full legal agent. Freed from the guardianship, most Roman women never escaped. But freedom, after such a life, was complex. Most of Rome still saw her as half divine, half ghost. She had lived apart from normal society for decades. No one had courted her. No one had seen her dance or flirt or laugh in the streets. Many men were wary of marrying a former Vestal. Some believed it would bring bad luck. Others, intimidated by her authority, simply avoided her. And yet, there were those who saw such a union as an honour, especially ambitious men hoping to bask in reflected sanctity. Marrying a former Vestal was like shaking hands with the gods. She brought status, wealth, and a name that Rome would never forget. But for the Vestal herself, adapting to life beyond the cloistered temple could feel disorienting. She had spent her girlhood in service, her adulthood in silence, her prime years in sacred duty. Now she entered a society that prized women for their families, not their rituals. Some former Vestals chose to marry late in life. Others never did. A few went on to advise emperors or manage estates with more influence than any senator's wife. They wore veils of a different kind now, ones woven from reputation, mystery, and the faint aura of divinity that never quite left them. Because even out of service, a former Vestal never really escaped her past. People still stepped aside in the streets. They still whispered her name with reverence. She might walk freely now, but she carried 30 years of fire with her, and Rome never forgot who once kept its flame alive. The flame of Vesta was extinguished in the 4th century CE, snuffed out not by wind or carelessness, but by empire-wide change. As Christianity spread and the old gods faded, Rome's sacred fires were allowed to go cold. The Temple of Vesta, once the heart of the Roman world, was left to crumble. And with it, the order of the Vestal Virgins disappeared. But their legacy didn't. For over 1,000 years the Vestals had stood apart. In a society where women were expected to serve quietly behind closed doors, they lived publicly, wielded authority, and were bound only to a goddess. They walked where men feared to tread,